Get on the ground. Hands where I can see them. The flashing red and blue lights painted the dark alley in chaos as Officer Reynolds pressed his knee hard into the back of a man lying face down on the cold, wet pavement. The man, dressed in a sharp navy blue suit, winced in pain as his arms were wrenched behind him. "I didn't do anything," he shouted, his voice edged with frustration and fear. "Yeah, that's what they all say," Officer Barnes sneered, tightening the cuffs around his wrists. The suspect, a tall, well-built black man in his early 40s, wasn't resisting. He wasn't running. He wasn't even shouting obscenities like they expected. But his calmness made the officers more suspicious. Reynolds grabbed him by the arm and yanked him up to his feet. "You match the description. A black male in a suit, seen leaving the jewelry store right after it got hit." The man took a deep breath, steadying himself. "I'm an attorney," he said through clenched teeth. "I was walking to my car. I didn't rob anyone." Barnes chuckled. "Oh, you're a lawyer? That's rich. You can argue your case at the station." A crowd had started to form near the sidewalk. Some were recording. A woman gasped. "That man ain't do nothing." "I need my phone," the man said, trying to keep his voice steady. "It's in my pocket." Reynolds shoved him against the patrol car. "Nice try. You're under arrest." The suspect closed his eyes for a moment, as if summoning patience. Then, as calmly as if he were ordering lunch, he said, "Call my brother." Barnes smirked. "Oh yeah? And who's your brother?" The man opened his eyes and looked directly at the officer. His voice was cool, controlled. "The U.S. Attorney General." For a moment, silence hung in the air like a thick fog. Then, "What?" Reynolds scoffed. But the suspect didn't reply. He simply held their gaze, letting the weight of his words sink in. The officers exchanged nervous glances. The crowd murmured. And somewhere in the distance, the sound of sirens grew louder. Earlier that evening, Damon Carter was a man of routine. Every evening after work, he liked to take a short walk before heading home. It was his way of unwinding, clearing his mind after a long day in court. Tonight had been no different. He had stepped out of the law firm where he worked, checked his watch, and decided to take a short detour past the newly opened jewelry store. He wasn't looking for anything in particular, just admiring the elegant displays, the sparkle of diamonds under soft lighting. He had smiled at the security guard on his way out, adjusting his cufflinks as he turned the corner toward the parking lot. That's when he heard the commotion. Shouting. A woman's scream. Then, the sound of shattering glass. Damon froze for a second, his instincts kicking in. He wasn't just a lawyer. He was a man who had spent years fighting for justice. He turned back toward the store just in time to see two masked men rush out, sprinting down the sidewalk. A few seconds later, the alarm blared. The security guard inside the store was shouting into his radio, but the thieves were already gone. Damon sighed, shaking his head. This city never changed. He adjusted his tie, hands in his pockets, and continued walking toward his car. That's when he saw the police cruiser pull up. Two officers jumped out, their eyes scanning the area. They locked onto him immediately. Damon stopped walking, already knowing where this was going. "You. Hands up." He sighed. "Here we go again." "Officer, I literally just walked past that store." Reynolds wasn't listening. He was too busy pulling Damon toward the squad car. "I don't know what kind of scam you're trying to run, but we got a positive ID. You match the description." "A black man in a suit?" Damon asked dryly. "That's the whole description?" "Stop talking," Barnes muttered. Damon wasn't resisting. He had been through this kind of situation before. Not quite like this, but close enough. The officers shoved him into the back of the patrol car. Damon exhaled slowly, pressing his lips together. Then, his lawyer brain kicked in. "I get one call," he said. Barnes leaned against the car door, arms crossed. "Yeah? Who you gonna call, your lawyer?" Damon gave him a small, knowing smile. "No," he said. "My brother." Barnes snorted. "Oh, that's cute. And who's your brother?" Damon looked at him, his face unreadable. "The U.S. Attorney General." The smirk disappeared from Barnes' face. For the first time since the arrest, a flicker of doubt crossed his features. Damon leaned back in his seat, calm and composed. "Go ahead," he said. "Call him." Barnes hesitated. Reynolds shifted uncomfortably. Then, the radio crackled. Dispatch to Unit 47, we just got the security footage. Suspects are two masked males, hoodies and jeans. Witness confirms they ran south. Barnes' jaw tightened. Reynolds cleared his throat. Damon arched an eyebrow. Something wrong, officer? The radio crackled again. Unit 47, confirm. Do you have a suspect in custody? Barnes didn't answer right away. His hand hovered over his radio. Damon watched them, his expression unreadable. The crowd was still watching. The cameras were still rolling. The tension in the air was thick. Then, from behind them, a black SUV pulled up. The door swung open, and out stepped a man in a dark suit, with a U.S. Department of Justice badge clipped to his belt. And just like that, the entire night changed. Silence. A thick, heavy kind of silence that made the air feel dense. Officer Barnes' fingers twitched near his holster, but he didn't move. His partner, Reynolds, took a small, uneasy step back, the realization sinking in. The man stepping out of the black SUV moved with purpose, his polished dress shoes clicking against the pavement. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and carried an authority that didn't need announcing. His piercing eyes locked onto Damon, then flicked to the two officers. And then, he spoke. Uncuff him. Now. Barnes swallowed hard. Sir, I said. The man cut in. His voice dangerously calm. Uncuff my brother. Neither of the officers moved. They had been cops for a long time, long enough to know when they had screwed up. But this wasn't just a mistake. This was a career-ending disaster in the making. Reynolds fumbled for his keys, his hands shaking slightly as he unlocked the cuffs. Damon rolled his shoulders as the metal restraints fell away, rubbing his wrists. His brother turned to him. Are you okay? Damon gave a small, knowing smirk. I've had better nights, Ethan. Ethan Carter, the U.S. Attorney General of the United States, turned back to the officers. Who's in charge here? Barnes' throat felt dry. That would be me, sir. Ethan took a slow step forward. Then you can explain to me why my brother, who was simply walking to his car, was thrown to the ground, handcuffed, and humiliated in front of a crowd. Barnes' mouth opened, then closed. Reynolds tried to save the moment. Sir, we were responding to a robbery. He matched the, do I look like I care about your excuse? Ethan interrupted. Reynolds flinched. The crowd had gone completely silent, watching the scene unfold like a real-life courtroom drama. Phones were still recording. The tension in the air was suffocating. Barnes cleared his throat. Sir, we didn't know who he was. Ethan's expression darkened. Ah, he said. So if he wasn't my brother, you would have just let this happen? Beaten him? Tossed him in jail for the night? Neither officer answered. Damon exhaled slowly, stepping in. Ethan, don't waste your breath. This isn't new. It happens every day to people who don't have someone powerful to step in for them. Ethan clenched his jaw. He knew his brother was right, and that made his anger burn even hotter. You two are suspended, he said, looking directly at Barnes and Reynolds. Barnes went pale. Sir, you can explain yourself to Internal Affairs, Ethan snapped. I'll be making a formal complaint to the chief myself. Reynolds' face contorted with panic. Sir, please. It was a mistake. Mistakes, Ethan said. His voice cold. Get innocent men killed. Another silence. This one even heavier than before. Damon patted his brother's arm. Come on, he said. Let's go. The brothers turned and walked toward the black SUV. The crowd parted for them like the Red Sea, some whispering, others shaking their heads. Before Damon got in the car, he turned back, locking eyes with the two officers one last time. Next time, he said quietly, maybe listen before you throw someone to the ground. Then, without another word, he climbed into the car. The SUV door shut. The engine rumbled. And just like that, they were gone. Less than an hour later, in a sleek, modern penthouse overlooking the Washington, D.C. skyline, Damon leaned against the kitchen counter, sipping a glass of water. Ethan stood across from him, still fuming. I swear, Ethan muttered, pacing back and forth, I should have them both fired. No, jailed. Something. Damon chuckled. You always did have a thing for justice. Ethan stopped pacing. This isn't funny. No, Damon agreed. It's not. But it is predictable. Ethan ran a hand down his face. You could have been hurt. I wasn't. That's not the point. Damon set his glass down and sighed. Ethan, this isn't new for me. You think this is the first time I've been stopped for walking while black? Ethan's fists clenched. This time, they got unlucky, Damon continued. This time, I had you. But how many people don't? Ethan didn't answer. The room fell silent. Then, Damon leaned forward, his voice softer. You have power, Ethan, he said. And I know you. You're going to do something about this. Ethan met his brother's gaze, his mind already racing. Damon wasn't wrong. This wasn't just about him. It never was. Ethan exhaled sharply. You're right. I usually am. Ethan rolled his eyes. Don't push it. Damon smirked. So what's next? Ethan's expression hardened with determination. I make sure this never happens again. But just as the words left his mouth, his phone rang. Ethan frowned, pulling it out of his pocket. The caller ID flashed. Unknown number. Damon arched an eyebrow. Who is it? Ethan hesitated. Then, he answered. Carter. For a second, silence. Then, a distorted, heavily modified voice spoke. You're making enemies, Mr. Attorney General. Ethan froze. The voice continued. Drop the case. Or next time, it won't just be a wrongful arrest. It'll be a funeral. Click. The call ended. The room was so silent, Damon could hear the pounding of his own heartbeat. Ethan slowly lowered the phone. His face was unreadable, but his jaw was set in stone. Damon straightened. Ethan? Ethan looked up, his eyes dark with something Damon had only seen a few times before. Rage, determination, and something else. War. Ethan Carter didn't move. He didn't blink. He just stood there, his phone still gripped tightly in his hand. Damon watched his brother's face carefully. He had seen Ethan angry before, but this was different. This was cold, calculated fury. What did they say? Damon finally asked. Ethan exhaled slowly, his voice low. They want me to drop the case. Damon's eyes narrowed. And if you don't? Ethan met his brother's gaze. They're threatening to kill me. A heavy silence filled the room. Damon's heartbeat quickened. This wasn't just about two cops messing up anymore. This was bigger. Much bigger. Damon leaned forward. Ethan, who exactly are we dealing with? Ethan tapped his phone screen, pulling up a recording app. He played the distorted voice back, listening carefully. You're making enemies, Mr. Attorney General. Drop the case. Or next time, it won't just be a wrongful arrest. It'll be a funeral. The words sent a chill down Damon's spine. Ethan locked his jaw. This isn't just about those two officers. Someone else doesn't want me digging into this. Damon ran a hand over his face. You think it's the police department? Ethan shook his head. If it was, they wouldn't be this sloppy. This is someone who knows I don't scare easily, but they're trying anyway. Damon exhaled sharply. So what's the plan? Ethan's eyes darkened. We fight back. The next morning, Ethan didn't go to his office. Instead, he went straight to the FBI's headquarters. The moment he stepped into the glass-walled conference room, heads turned. Agents straightened their ties. Some even whispered. No one summoned the Attorney General of the United States. If he was here, it meant something serious was happening. Ethan placed his phone on the table and pressed play. The distorted voice echoed through the room. By the time it ended, the entire room was dead silent. Finally, a man at the end of the table, Special Agent William Foster, cleared his throat. Sir, are you saying someone just threatened the U.S. Attorney General? Ethan met his gaze. That's exactly what I'm saying. Foster leaned back in his chair. Do you have any idea who this might be? That's what I want you to find out, Ethan replied. The room buzzed with low murmurs. One agent, a young woman with sharp eyes, spoke up. Sir, the voice is obviously modulated, but we might be able to trace the call. Ethan nodded. Then do it. Foster hesitated. Sir, with all due respect, maybe you should lay low for a while. Ethan scoffed. And let them think they scared me? He leaned forward. I want every possible lead followed. I want surveillance on every officer in that precinct. And I want to know who the hell thinks they can threaten me." The room was silent for a beat. Then, one by one, the agents nodded. Foster sighed. "All right, sir. We're on it." Ethan straightened. "Good." He grabbed his phone and turned to leave. But just as he reached the door, Foster called out, "Sir?" Ethan glanced back. Foster hesitated, then said, "Be careful." Ethan didn't reply. He just walked out. Meanwhile, across town, Damon Carter sat in his apartment, scrolling through news articles. The video of his wrongful arrest had already gone viral. Attorney wrongfully arrested. Brutality or mistaken identity? U.S. Attorney General's brother detained. Officers suspended. The internet was on fire. Some people were outraged. Others were defending the officers. Damon sighed. He knew how these stories went. Tomorrow, something else would make headlines, and people would forget. Unless his phone buzzed. A message from Ethan. "Stay home today. Things are getting messy." Damon frowned. Messy how? Before he could reply, there was a knock at his door. Damon glanced at the time. It was barely noon. He wasn't expecting anyone. He got up, walking cautiously toward the door. "Who is it?" No answer. His instincts kicked in. Something wasn't right. Slowly, he reached for the baseball bat he kept by the door. Just in case. Another knock. This one harder. Damon's grip tightened. "Who's there?" he demanded. Then, bang. The door burst open. Two masked men stormed in, dressed in all black. Damon barely had time to react before one of them lunged at him. He swung the bat, but the second man grabbed his wrist, twisting it violently. Pain shot through his arm. He tried to fight back, but they were fast, too fast. A fist slammed into his gut, knocking the air out of him. He stumbled backward, vision blurring. Then, one of the men grabbed him by the collar, shoving him against the wall. A low, mechanical voice whispered in his ear, "You should have stayed quiet." Damon barely registered the words before something hard crashed against his skull. His vision exploded into darkness. Darkness. Damon Carter's head throbbed like a drum being beaten from the inside. His mind swam in confusion as he slowly regained consciousness. The sharp metallic scent of blood filled his nostrils, and a dull pain radiated from the side of his head. His eyelids felt like lead, but he forced them open. He wasn't in his apartment anymore. Dim, flickering light bulbs buzzed overhead, casting eerie shadows along the cracked concrete walls. The room was small, damp, and smelled of rust and mold. A basement. He tried to move, but his wrists were tied behind the chair he was sitting in. His ankles were bound too. Panic surged through him, but he forced himself to breathe. Stay calm. Think. A door creaked open. Footsteps. Two men stepped into the room. The same ones who had attacked him. They were still wearing masks, their figures shadowed by the dim light. Damon clenched his jaw. If this is some kind of robbery, you picked the wrong guy. The taller of the two chuckled. "Oh, we know exactly who you are, Mr. Carter." The voice was different from the one that had called Ethan. This one wasn't distorted. Whoever these men were, they didn't care if he heard their real voices. That meant one thing. They weren't planning on letting him go. Damon swallowed hard. "Look, whatever this is." A heavy fist cracked against his jaw. His head snapped to the side, pain exploding through his face. The second man crouched in front of him. "This isn't a negotiation." Damon coughed, blood dripping from his lip. "Then what is it?" The taller man leaned in. "A warning." Damon kept his breathing steady. "You got a problem with me, fine. But dragging me into a basement to rough me up? Seems a little personal." The man grabbed Damon's chin, forcing him to look up. "It is personal. Your brother should have left things alone." Damon's stomach twisted. This was about Ethan. And if they had gone after him, it meant Ethan was in more danger than he realized. The shorter man pulled out a switchblade, flicking it open with a metallic click. He twirled it between his fingers, watching Damon with amusement. "Your brother's a powerful man," he said. "But even powerful men have limits." Damon narrowed his eyes. "And what's yours?" The man grinned. "Right about here." He raised the blade. Then, The sound of a phone ringing cut through the room. The taller man cursed under his breath and pulled a phone from his pocket. Damon caught a glimpse of the screen. Unknown caller. The man hesitated, then answered. Yeah. A voice crackled on the other end. Damon couldn't hear it clearly, but whatever was being said made the man's posture stiffen. Then, suddenly, the masked man's face turned pale. Damon watched, confused, as the man's hand trembled slightly around the phone. Understood, the man muttered. He hung up. A tense silence filled the room. The shorter man looked at his partner. What is it? The taller man hesitated. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, We need to go. The second man blinked. What? I said, we need to go. Something in his tone made the shorter man straighten. Without another word, he shoved the knife back into his pocket. They untied Damon's hands and ankles, pushing him forward roughly. Get out, the taller man growled. Damon was too stunned to argue. His legs wobbled beneath him as he stumbled toward the exit. The moment he stepped outside, the door slammed shut behind him. He was free. But why? Damon sucked in deep breaths, trying to steady his pounding heart. His head was still foggy, but one thought burned clear in his mind. That phone call. Whoever was on the other end had just saved his life. Meanwhile, across town, Ethan Carter stood in his office, his phone pressed tightly to his ear. I don't care how you do it, he said coldly. I want my brother safe. The voice on the other end was smooth, calculated. Consider it done. Ethan exhaled, gripping the edge of his desk. And the men who took him? There was a pause. Then, they won't be a problem anymore. Ethan clenched his jaw. He knew what that meant. Justice, as he enforced it, had rules. But there were certain lines even he was willing to cross when it came to family. He ended the call. For the first time that day, he allowed himself to breathe. Damon was safe. But this wasn't over. Someone had gone after his brother to send him a message. Now, it was his turn to send one back. Ethan grabbed his coat, stepping out of his office. War had been declared, and he was ready to fight. Damon Carter sat on the edge of his bed, his hands still trembling slightly. He had barely made it back to his apartment, his body sore from the beating, his mind racing with questions. He should have been dead. Those men hadn't just wanted to scare him. They were ready to make an example out of him. Yet, the moment that phone rang, everything changed. Someone powerful, had called off the attack. His phone buzzed on the nightstand. Ethan. Damon exhaled and answered. Yeah. Are you okay? Ethan's voice was sharp, controlled, but Damon could hear the tension beneath it. I'm alive, Damon muttered, rubbing his temple. I guess that counts for something. I need details. Damon leaned back against the pillows. Two guys. Masks. Took me to some basement. Smacked me around. Told me you were pushing too hard. He paused. Then someone called them. And they let me go. Silence. Damon frowned. Ethan? What aren't you telling me? Ethan sighed. I made a call. Damon sat up straighter. To who? Ethan didn't answer right away. People who owed me a favor. Damon ran a hand through his hair. Ethan, what did you do? I made sure those men wouldn't touch you again, Ethan said simply. Damon could hear it in his tone. This wasn't just a warning. This was something deeper, darker. Are they dead? Damon asked quietly. Ethan didn't answer. Damon clenched his jaw. Ethan, don't ask questions you don't want the answers to. A heavy silence settled between them. Damon finally exhaled. This is getting out of control. No, Ethan said. This is exactly where it needs to be. Damon shook his head. Ethan, these aren't just dirty cops. Whoever's pulling the strings has real power. They're not afraid of the law. Ethan's voice was steel. Then I'll make them afraid of me. The next morning, Ethan Carter stood in the conference room of the Department of Justice, facing his top advisors and federal prosecutors. The room was tense, filled with the weight of what was happening. Ethan placed a folder on the table. I want everything we have on police corruption in this city. I want names, reports, patterns. His voice was cold, unwavering. No more cover-ups. No more excuses. The officials exchanged uneasy glances. One of them, an older man named Charles Bentley, cleared his throat. Sir, This could expose some very powerful people. Ethan locked eyes with him. Good. Bentley hesitated. And if they push back? Ethan leaned forward. Let them. The room went silent. Then, the young female prosecutor from the FBI meeting, Agent Melissa Hayes, spoke up. Sir, I started running voice recognition on the call that threatened you, she said. It scrambled, but I found something. Ethan arched an eyebrow. Go on. Melissa pushed a file toward him. There's a 78% probability that the person speaking is former police chief Harold Langley. Ethan's expression didn't change, but inside, his blood ran cold. Langley. The man had retired from the force years ago, but rumors swirled that he still had his hands deep in city politics. And more importantly, he had been personally responsible for covering up police brutality cases for decades. If he was involved in this, Ethan exhaled sharply. This goes deeper than I thought, he muttered. Bentley folded his hands. Sir, going after Langley is a declaration of war. The old guard in this city will rally behind him. Ethan met his gaze, eyes burning with intensity. Then they'll fall with him. That evening, Damon sat at his desk, staring at his laptop. His law firm had given him the day off, but he couldn't rest. He had spent the last few hours digging, looking into his own case. What he found only made his stomach turn. The arrest report from Officer Barnes was full of inconsistencies. The store's security footage confirmed that the actual suspects were two men who looked nothing like him. Yet, the officers had still targeted him. Damon leaned back, exhaling slowly. He wasn't stupid. He had seen the justice system fail black men too many times to be surprised. But this felt different. This wasn't just a case of racial profiling. This was intentional. Before he could think too much about it, his phone vibrated. Unknown number. His pulse quickened. Not this again. He hesitated, then answered. Hello? A low voice came through the line. If you want to know the truth, meet me at the old train station. Alone. Damon's breath caught. Who is this? Click. The line went dead. His gut screamed at him to ignore it. But his mind? It told him he was too deep to stop now. He grabbed his jacket. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about the truth. And he was going to find it. Damon Carter sat behind the wheel of his car, gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. The old train station loomed ahead, its crumbling bricks and shattered windows swallowed by the night. This place had been abandoned for years. The perfect location for a setup. His instincts screamed at him to turn around, to call Ethan, to not walk into a meeting with someone who refused to identify themselves. But Damon had spent his entire life chasing the truth, and if he backed down now, he'd never forgive himself. He exhaled, pulled the hood of his jacket over his head, and stepped out of the car. The wind howled through the broken beams of the station. Streetlights flickered. Damon took slow, steady steps toward the entrance, his ears straining for the sound of movement. Nothing. Then, a figure emerged from the shadows. Damon's body tensed. The man was tall, wrapped in a long trench coat, his face hidden beneath a baseball cap. He kept his hands in his pockets, but Damon could tell he was carrying something. A weapon? A recording? Only one way to find out. Damon stopped a few feet away. You're the one who called me. The man nodded. Damon swallowed hard. Who are you? The man hesitated, then slowly lifted his head. The dim light caught the edge of his face, and Damon felt his heart stop. He knew this man. Officer Reynolds, he whispered. The same cop who had slammed him onto the pavement. The one who had arrested him. The one who had smirked while doing it. Everything inside Damon screamed to lunge at him, to demand answers. But he forced himself to stay still. Reynolds looked different now. His eyes darted around, scanning the shadows. His face was pale, thin, and for the first time, Damon saw fear in them. I don't have much time, Reynolds said. Damon crossed his arms. You had plenty of time when you threw me in handcuffs. Reynolds exhaled sharply. You think I don't know that? You think I don't regret it? Damon clenched his jaw. Reynolds continued. Barnes and I were following orders. That night, we were told to find you. Damon frowned. Told by who? Reynolds hesitated. Then, he reached into his pocket. Damon's entire body tensed, but Reynolds didn't pull out a gun. Instead, He handed him a flash drive. "This has everything," Reynolds said. "Your arrest wasn't random. Someone wanted you in police custody." Damon's blood ran cold. "Who?" Reynolds' throat bobbed. "Harold Langley." The name hit Damon like a punch to the gut. His head spun. Harold Langley, the former police chief. The same man Ethan was now investigating. It was all connected. Damon gripped the flash drive tightly. "Why are you telling me this now?" Reynolds glanced around nervously. "Because I don't want to die." Damon's breath caught. "What are you talking about?" Reynolds licked his lips. "Barnes. He's dead." Damon's stomach dropped. "What?" Reynolds' voice shook. "Found in his apartment this morning. Gunshot wound to the head. No forced entry. No signs of a struggle." Damon's heart pounded. "A cover-up?" Reynolds nodded. "Langley's cleaning house. And if he finds out I talked to you—" His voice trailed off. Damon took a shaky breath. This was bigger than he thought. Langley had ordered his arrest. He had Barnes killed. And now, Reynolds was next. Damon clenched his jaw. "You need protection." Reynolds shook his head. "No. I need to disappear." Damon exhaled. "And what am I supposed to do with this?" He lifted the flash drive. Reynolds' eyes darkened. "Expose him." Then, a noise. Footsteps. Damon turned sharply, but it was too late. The crack of a gunshot shattered the night. Reynolds let out a strangled gasp. Damon watched in horror as the officer stumbled forward, blood blossoming across his chest. A second shot rang out. Damon barely had time to move. Pain tore through his side, knocking the air out of his lungs. His vision blurred, but he forced himself to look up. A figure stood in the shadows, gun still raised. Then, they turned and vanished into the night. Damon fell to his knees, gripping his side. His fingers were wet with blood. Reynolds collapsed beside him, gasping for breath. Damon pressed a hand against his wound. "Stay with me." Reynolds' lips trembled. "It's too late." "No," Damon whispered. "We're getting out of here." Reynolds' breath hitched. "I'm sorry." Damon felt the life drain out of him. The officer's body went limp. And just like that, he was gone. Damon swallowed hard. He had to move. Had to get out of here. He forced himself to his feet, his vision swimming. His side burned, but he ignored the pain. His fingers tightened around the flash drive. He had what he needed. But now, they knew. And they weren't going to stop until he was dead too. Stumbling forward, Damon pressed a hand against his wound and disappeared into the night. He needed to get to Ethan. Because now, this wasn't just about justice. It was about survival. Damon Carter's breath came in ragged gasps as he stumbled through the empty streets, his vision blurring from the blood loss. The pain in his side burned like fire, but he forced himself to keep moving. He had to reach Ethan. His mind raced. Officer Reynolds was dead. Barnes was dead. And now, whoever had pulled the trigger tonight wanted him dead too. Damon's fingers clenched around the flash drive in his pocket. He didn't know exactly what was on it yet, but one thing was clear. Harold Langley wasn't just a corrupt ex-cop. He was a murderer. The city lights blurred as he made his way toward the only person who could help him, his brother. Ethan Carter was reviewing files in his penthouse office when his phone rang. He frowned. It was past midnight. He answered. "Carter," heavy breathing on the other end. Then, "Ethan." Damon's voice was weak, strained. Ethan's body went rigid. "Damon? What's wrong?" "I've been shot." Ethan's heart slammed against his ribs. "Where are you?" Damon coughed. "Near 8th and Monroe." "I don't think I can." His voice trailed off. Ethan was already moving, grabbing his car keys. "Stay awake." "I'm coming." Damon exhaled weakly. "Ethan." "What?" "I know who's behind this." The call cut off. Ethan's blood ran cold. He sprinted to his car. If his brother died tonight, so help him. Whoever was responsible was going to wish they had never been born. Ethan pulled up to the darkened street corner, his tires screeching against the pavement. Then, he saw him. Damon was slumped against a lamppost, one hand clutching his bleeding side, his face pale. Ethan threw the door open and rushed to his side. "Damon, stay with me." Damon blinked slowly, his breathing shallow. "You're late." Ethan ignored him and pressed a hand against the wound. Blood seeped through Damon's jacket, staining Ethan's fingers. "You need a hospital," Ethan said. Damon groaned. "No, no hospitals. They'll find me." Ethan clenched his jaw. His brother was right. If Langley had cops on his payroll, there was no telling who was watching the hospitals. Ethan made a decision. He wrapped an arm around Damon and half-carried him to the car. "I know a place." Damon didn't argue. He was too weak. As Ethan drove, his grip on the steering wheel tightened. Whoever did this was going to pay, and they were going to pay in blood. 15 minutes later, Ethan pulled up to a quiet suburban home. The porch light flickered on, and a woman stepped outside, wearing a worn sweatshirt and jeans. Her expression turned to shock when she saw Ethan helping Damon out of the car. "Oh my God, bring him inside." Ethan carried Damon into the house, lowering him onto the couch. The woman immediately pulled on a pair of medical gloves. "How bad is it?" Ethan pressed a hand to his brother's forehead. "He's lost a lot of blood." The woman grabbed a medical kit from the coffee table. "I need to see the wound." Ethan hesitated. "Can you help him?" She met his gaze. "I've stitched up worse." Damon groaned as she carefully pulled back his shirt, revealing the bullet wound on his side. Ethan watched, jaw clenched, as she worked quickly, disinfecting the wound and stitching it up with practiced hands. Damon hissed in pain but didn't complain. After what felt like an eternity, she finally leaned back. "He's stable." Ethan exhaled in relief. Damon blinked at her. "Who are you?" She smirked. "Dr. Julia Morales. Retired surgeon." Damon frowned. "Retired?" She glanced at Ethan. "Your brother and I go way back." Damon's tired eyes moved to Ethan. "You really do have people everywhere, huh?" Ethan didn't respond. He was staring at Damon's pocket, where the flash drive was barely visible. Ethan reached for it. "What's this?" Damon weakly placed a hand over it. "Proof." Ethan's heart pounded. "Proof of what?" Damon swallowed hard. "Langley. He's been covering up murders." Ethan's stomach turned. Damon forced himself to sit up. "I need you to see what's on here." Ethan hesitated, then stood. "Julia, keep an eye on him." She nodded. Ethan grabbed his laptop and inserted the flash drive. A file opened. Then, his blood ran ice cold. Police reports, autopsy photos, surveillance footage, all tied to Harold Langley. One name stood out in the files. A young black man named Jason Holloway, killed in police custody. Cause of death? Accidental injuries. The real cause? Blunt force trauma to the skull. Ethan's hands curled into fists. Langley had murdered him. And worse, it had been covered up. Ethan's heart pounded. "Damon, this is enough to bury Langley." Damon nodded weakly. "That's why he wants me dead." Ethan's jaw clenched. "Then we hit him first." Damon exhaled. "How?" Ethan's eyes burned with cold fury. "By making sure the whole world sees this." But before he could say another word, a car screeched to a stop outside. Julia stiffened. "Did you tell anyone where you were going?" Ethan and Damon exchanged glances. Then, boom, the front door burst open. Gunmen stormed inside. Ethan reached for his gun, but the first bullet had already been fired. Damon's body jerked backward, and his world went black. The gunshot rang through the small house like an explosion. Damon Carter felt the impact before he even processed what had happened. His body was flung backward, his vision darkening as pain ripped through him. Somewhere in the background, Ethan was shouting. Julia was moving. The gunmen were advancing. Damon hit the ground hard, gasping for air. No, not like this. His mind screamed at him to stay conscious, but his body betrayed him. His vision blurred. His limbs felt heavy. Then, more gunfire. Pop, pop, pop. Screams. Chaos. And then, darkness. Ethan Carter had never been more furious in his life. The moment the door burst open, instinct took over. He shoved the coffee table on its side, using it for cover as bullets ripped through the air. Julia was already pulling a pistol from under the couch. The first gunman barely had time to react before she fired 2 shots, both hitting him square in the chest. He went down hard. The second gunman turned toward her, but Ethan was already moving. He tackled the man with full force, slamming him into the wall. The gun clattered to the floor. Ethan didn't hesitate. A single, well-placed punch sent the attacker crashing onto the coffee table, which snapped under the weight. Julia grabbed the last standing gunman and pistol-whipped him across the jaw. Silence. The three gunmen lay motionless. Ethan's heart pounded. His ears rang from the gunfire. Then, he turned to see Damon on the floor. His brother's eyes were closed, blood pooling beneath him. No, no, no. Ethan dropped to his knees beside him. Damon, stay with me. Julia knelt down, checking his pulse. He's alive, she said quickly. But we need to move now. Ethan's stomach twisted. He pressed his hand against the wound, trying to slow the bleeding. Damon let out a weak groan. He was fading. Ethan's hands shook. His mind raced. If he lost Damon? No, not an option. Ethan looked at Julia. Can you patch him up? She hesitated. He needs a hospital. Ethan's jaw tightened. We can't take him to a hospital. Langley owns half the cops in this city. Julia bit her lip, then exhaled sharply. Help me get him to the back room. I'll do what I can. Ethan carefully lifted his brother, blood soaking into his shirt. Damon barely moved. His breathing was shallow. Ethan carried him down the hall, his pulse hammering in his ears. Hold on, Damon. Just hold on. Julia worked fast, her hands steady as she cleaned and stitched the wound. Ethan paced nearby, his fists clenched. His heart felt like it was being squeezed in a vice. Minutes stretched into an eternity. Finally, Julia exhaled. He'll make it. Ethan's shoulders sagged in relief. But he needs rest, Julia added. And so do you. Ethan shook his head. I'm not stopping until Langley is behind bars. Julia studied him for a long moment. You're not thinking straight. Ethan met her gaze. I've never thought more clearly in my life. He turned toward the front room, stepping over the bodies of the unconscious gunmen. He picked up one of their phones. There was only one number in the call log. Ethan pressed redial. The phone rang once, twice. Then, a voice answered. You should have taken the warning, Carter. Ethan's blood boiled. Langley. The man on the other end chuckled. You're in over your head. Ethan's grip tightened. You sent men to kill my brother. Langley's voice was smug. He should have stayed out of my business. Ethan's teeth clenched. You just made the biggest mistake of your life. Langley chuckled. And what are you going to do about it? Ethan's voice was like steel. I'm going to burn your whole operation to the ground. A long pause. Then, Langley's voice turned cold. You won't live long enough to try. Click. The line went dead. Ethan slowly lowered the phone. His mind was racing. This wasn't just about justice anymore. Langley had declared war, and Ethan was ready to fight. He turned to Julia. I need to disappear for a while. She frowned. What? I need to be off the grid. No calls. No emails. Nothing. Julia's eyes darkened. What are you planning? Ethan didn't blink. I'm going to take Langley down from the inside. Julia swallowed hard. Ethan, that's suicide. Ethan shook his head. No, he said. It's justice. Meanwhile, across town, Harold Langley sat in his dimly lit office, swirling a glass of whiskey in his hand. His phone was still warm from the call. Ethan Carter was a problem that needed to be eliminated. Langley pressed a button on his desk. A voice answered. Yes, sir. Langley leaned forward, his voice dripping with malice. Find Carter. He smirked. And this time, make sure he doesn't get back up. Ethan Carter disappeared. Not in the way a man vanishes from the face of the earth, but in the way a shadow blends into the night, unseen, untraceable, and waiting. He had learned a long time ago that when hunting monsters, sometimes you had to become one yourself. Langley had underestimated him. That was his first mistake, and it would be his last. 3 days later, Damon Carter's eyelids fluttered open to the sound of faint rain tapping against the window. Pain. His entire body felt like it had been through a war. He groaned, attempting to sit up, but a sharp sting in his side reminded him of the bullet wound. A soft voice broke through the haze. Take it easy. Damon turned his head slightly and saw Julia sitting beside him, arms crossed. Where? He swallowed. His throat was dry. Where's Ethan? Julia's expression darkened. He's gone. Damon's heart skipped a beat. What do you mean gone? She sighed, rubbing her temples. He left 2 nights ago. No calls. No messages. Nothing. Damon swung his legs over the bed, wincing. That idiot. Julia arched an eyebrow. He's trying to protect you. Damon shook his head. No, he's hunting. Julia didn't respond. Damon could see the worry in her eyes. Ethan had always been the rational one, the strategist, the man who played by the book, except when it came to family. And this time, he wasn't just playing defense. He was out for blood. Damon pushed himself up, his breathing shaky. I need to find him. Julia placed a hand on his chest, forcing him back down. You're not going anywhere. Damon clenched his jaw. You don't get it. If Ethan is doing what I think he's doing, he's in more danger than ever. Julia exhaled sharply. And if you go running after him in your condition, you'll be the one in a body bag. Damon didn't care. Langley had tried to have him killed. And now, his brother was walking straight into the lion's den. He had to stop him, before it was too late. Meanwhile, Ethan Carter sat in the back of a dimly lit bar, dressed in clothes that didn't belong to him. A worn leather jacket, a pair of faded jeans, a hat pulled low over his face. The disguise wasn't perfect, but it was enough. Enough to make people hesitate before recognizing him. Enough to keep Langley's men from spotting him, for now. The bartender, a burly man with a thick beard, approached with a glass of whiskey. From the gentleman in the corner, he said, nodding toward the back of the bar. Ethan didn't turn his head immediately. He already knew who it was. A man named Vincent Grayson, ex-cop, former enforcer for Langley, and the key to unraveling everything. Ethan took a slow sip before finally meeting the man's gaze. Vincent gave a small smirk. Didn't expect to see you in a place like this. Ethan set his glass down. Didn't expect to be here. Vincent leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. You know, Langley's been looking for you. Ethan chuckled dryly. I'm counting on it. Vincent studied him carefully. You planning to take him down? Ethan didn't blink. I'm planning to end this. Vincent exhaled, shaking his head. You've got guts, Carter. But you don't know the kind of man you're dealing with. Ethan leaned forward. Then tell me. Vincent hesitated. Ethan could see the war in his eyes. Loyalty versus fear. Conscience versus survival. Finally, Vincent spoke. Langley's not just some corrupt ex-cop, he muttered. He's running everything. Drug trades, arms deals, human trafficking. If you think he's just another dirty cop, you're dead wrong. Ethan's stomach twisted. He had suspected Langley was involved in more than just covering up police brutality. But this was organized crime on a national scale. Ethan's voice was steady. And where do you fit in? Vincent sighed. I did some things for him in the past. Things I'm not proud of. He took a slow sip of his drink. But I've been trying to get out. Ethan raised an eyebrow. Trying? Vincent let out a humorless chuckle. You don't leave Langley. Ethan folded his hands together. Then let's give you a way out. Vincent's jaw tightened. Then, after a long moment, he reached into his jacket and pulled out a flash drive. Ethan's pulse quickened. What's on it? Vincent slid it across the table. Everything. Financial records. Smuggling routes. Names of officers on his payroll. Ethan's fingers curled around the drive. This was it. The evidence he needed. But before he could say another word, boom. The bar door slammed open. Gunfire erupted. Glass shattered. People screamed. Ethan dove to the floor as bullets tore through the air. Vincent flipped the table, using it as cover. Ethan reached for his gun, eyes scanning the chaos. Langley's men. They had found him, and they weren't here to talk. Vincent cursed under his breath. We gotta move. Ethan nodded. No more hiding. No more waiting. It was time to fight back. He clenched the flash drive in one hand and his gun in the other. And then, he fired. Gunfire ripped through the bar. Ethan Carter ducked behind an overturned table, gripping his gun tightly. The air was thick with the acrid scent of gunpowder, the screams of panicked patrons echoing around him. Vincent Grayson reloaded his weapon beside him. This is bad, he muttered. Ethan smirked grimly. No kidding. Another round of bullets sprayed overhead, shattering bottles behind the bar. Ethan peeked over the edge of the table. 4 men, heavily armed, moving in a coordinated formation. Trained killers. Langley wasn't playing games anymore. Vincent cursed. I count 4. How about you? 4, Ethan confirmed. Maybe more outside. Vincent exhaled. You got a plan? Ethan nodded. Yeah. Don't die. Vincent rolled his eyes. Fantastic plan. Ethan glanced at the flash drive still clutched in his fist. He couldn't afford to lose it. Not now. Not when it had the power to end Langley. The men were advancing. Ethan could hear their boots crunching against the debris-strewn floor. On my signal, Ethan whispered. We split. Vincent gave a small nod. Ethan counted down in his head. 3, 2, 1. Now. Ethan spun out from behind the table, firing 2 quick shots. The first gunman crumpled instantly. The second staggered back, clutching his shoulder. Vincent took out a third man with a precise shot to the leg, then lunged forward, slamming the butt of his gun against his head. The fourth man turned his weapon toward Ethan, but Ethan was faster. 1 bullet to the chest. The gunman dropped. Silence. Ethan and Vincent stood panting, surrounded by broken glass and bodies. You good? Ethan asked, breathless. Vincent wiped blood off his cheek. Yeah, but we need to move. Now. Ethan grabbed the flash drive from the floor and stuffed it into his pocket. Then, a single, slow clap echoed through the now silent bar. Ethan froze. The sound came from the entrance. And then, through the swirling dust, Harold Langley stepped inside. Dressed in a perfectly tailored suit, hands in his pockets, eyes filled with quiet amusement. Ethan's jaw clenched. Langley took a step forward, shaking his head. Impressive, Carter. I have to say, you're persistent. But persistence doesn't win wars. Ethan raised his gun. Maybe not. But this. He tapped his pocket where the flash drive was. This does. Langley's smile never wavered. Then, a dozen men stepped in behind him, all armed. Ethan and Vincent exchanged a glance. They were outnumbered. Badly. Langley sighed. You should have walked away, Carter. You should have taken the hint. Ethan exhaled. Yeah, well, I never was good at following orders. Langley smirked. That's a shame. He turned to his men. Kill them. Chaos erupted. Ethan and Vincent dove for cover as bullets rained down. Ethan fired back, taking down 2 men in quick succession. Vincent grabbed a fallen gun and emptied the clip into another. But there were too many. Too many to fight. Too many to run. Ethan's mind raced. They had to escape. His eyes darted to the bar's back door. A way out. Vincent. Back exit. Ethan shouted. Vincent nodded, laying down cover fire. Ethan sprinted toward the door, ducking low. A bullet grazed his arm, but he didn't stop. He kicked the door open and ran straight into 3 more armed men. A fist slammed into his ribs. The world spun. Ethan hit the ground hard, the flash drive slipping from his grip. Vincent tried to fight them off, but there were too many. He was tackled to the ground, his gun wrenched from his hands. Then, a sharp pain exploded in Ethan's head. Everything went black. Somewhere unknown, Ethan groaned as he regained consciousness. His hands were tied behind his back. His head pounded. His lip was split. A dim light flickered above him. He was sitting in a chair. Opposite him, Vincent was slumped against a metal pole, barely conscious. And standing in front of them was Harold Langley. Ethan exhaled. Gotta say, Langley, your hospitality sucks. Langley chuckled. Glad you're awake. I'd hate for you to miss your own execution. Ethan forced a smirk. Gonna have to try harder than that. Langley's expression darkened. You don't get it, do you? You lost. The moment you stepped into my world, you lost. Ethan's jaw tightened. I have the evidence. The flash drive. Langley reached into his pocket and held up the small device. Ethan's stomach dropped. Langley smirked. You mean this? Vincent groaned. Damn it. Langley turned the drive over in his fingers. I admire your determination, Carter. Really, I do. But you're out of moves. Ethan clenched his fists. Langley leaned in. This doesn't end with you in a courtroom. This ends with you dead. Ethan smirked. If you were gonna kill me, you would have done it already. Langley tilted his head. True. He stepped back, motioning to one of his men. Take them to the docks. Make it quiet. Ethan's muscles tensed. No, not like this. The guards moved toward them. Vincent whispered, Got any miracles left? Ethan's mind raced. He needed an out. A distraction. Something. Then, a loud bang echoed through the warehouse. The guards froze. Another bang, this time closer. Shouting. Gunfire. Then, a voice Ethan knew all too well. Damon. Ethan's eyes widened. His brother had come for him. Gunfire erupted outside. Langley's men scrambled. Ethan saw his moment and took it. He swung his chair forward, slamming into Langley's closest guard. The man stumbled, giving Ethan just enough time to twist his wrists against the restraints. Vincent lunged, tackling another guard. The warehouse doors burst open. Damon stood there, bloody but alive, a gun in his shaking hands. Miss me? Damon rasped. Ethan smirked. You really know how to make an entrance. Damon fired. The fight was back on. Langley's men scattered, returning fire. Ethan ripped the ropes free and grabbed a fallen gun. Vincent did the same. It was war. And by the time it was over, Langley was going down. Gunfire roared through the warehouse like a thunderstorm. Ethan Carter moved with deadly precision, dodging bullets as he fired back. His training, his years in law enforcement, all of it had prepared him for moments like this. But this time, it was personal. Damon, still weakened from his injuries, gritted his teeth as he ducked behind a metal crate, his hands trembling as he reloaded his gun. His breath was ragged, but his resolve was firm. Vincent Grayson fought beside them, his movements swift and brutal. For a man who once worked for Langley, he was now fighting like he had nothing left to lose. The warehouse was in chaos. Langley's men were dropping one by one. But then, Langley ran. Ethan spotted him slipping through a back exit, disappearing into the night. His jaw clenched. No, not this time. Ethan turned to Damon. Can you hold them off? Damon's face was pale, his shirt soaked with blood, but he gave a small nod. Go. Ethan didn't hesitate. He sprinted after Langley. The final chase. The cold night air hit Ethan's face as he burst out of the warehouse. Langley was ahead of him, running toward a waiting black SUV. Ethan raised his gun. Bang! The bullet shattered the back window of the SUV, missing Langley by inches. Langley flinched but kept running. Ethan pushed himself harder. His legs burned, but he didn't stop. Langley was almost to the driver's seat. Ethan lunged. He tackled Langley just as he reached the door, slamming him into the side of the SUV. Langley grunted, swinging wildly. Ethan ducked, then drove his fist into Langley's gut. The former police chief stumbled, coughing. Ethan grabbed him by the collar. This is over, Langley. Langley spat blood. You think so? He reached for a hidden gun. Ethan didn't give him the chance. Crack. One well-placed punch knocked the gun from Langley's grasp. Langley fell to the ground, groaning. Ethan loomed over him, breathing heavily. The fight was over. But Ethan wasn't done yet. Justice served. Minutes later, sirens screamed in the distance. Damon, limping, approached with Vincent by his side. You got him? Damon asked, breathing heavily. Ethan nodded, his gun still trained on Langley. Yeah. He's not going anywhere. Langley sneered. You have no idea what you've done. Ethan's jaw clenched. I know exactly what I've done. The sirens grew louder. Red and blue lights flashed against the darkened streets. Then, the police cars skidded to a stop. But this time, they weren't under Langley's control. FBI agents poured out, weapons drawn. Agent Melissa Hayes stepped forward. Harold Langley, she said, her voice cool. You're under arrest for conspiracy, murder, and corruption on a federal level. Langley laughed bitterly. You think prison can hold me? Ethan stepped closer, his eyes dark. You'll never see the outside of a cell again. Langley's face twisted with rage as the agents hauled him to his feet, cuffing his wrists behind his back. Damon let out a shaky breath. It's over. Ethan nodded. Yeah, and for the first time in a long time, justice had won. 1 week later, Damon sat on the balcony of Ethan's penthouse, watching the sunrise. His side still ached, but he was alive. And Langley? Locked away, awaiting trial. The evidence from the flash drive had been enough to unravel his entire operation. Dozens of dirty cops, politicians, and criminals were now being investigated. It wasn't just a win. It was a reckoning. Ethan stepped outside, 2 mugs of coffee in hand. He handed one to Damon before sitting beside him. Damon smirked. "So, you ever gonna stop playing hero?" Ethan chuckled. "Not in this lifetime." Damon exhaled, staring at the city skyline. "We did it." Ethan took a sip of his coffee. "Yeah." He glanced at his brother. "You gonna be okay?" Damon nodded slowly. "I think so." Ethan smirked. "Good." The two brothers sat in silence, watching the city come to life. For the first time in weeks, they were at peace. And no matter what came next, they knew one thing for certain. They had already won.